Okay, so the ending to chapter 1130 might be one of the single greatest character reveals we've had in the entirety of One Piece. No, like seriously, that right there gave me goosebumps. And after 3 weeks of a fun and wacky adventure dealing with the fake sun god, giant animals, and a Lego village, we finally get back to a much more serious plotline with some major reveals and lore dumps surrounding the giants and the current state of their kingdom. But the most important reveal we get in this week's chapter is that we finally get confirmation that we are indeed on Elbaf, as we get a double page spread showing the entire island, which shows us a landscape made up of mostly a series of giant mountains with the Yggdrasil tree towering over them. The real one, not the fake one we saw in Rose's little diorama. Though simply calling it a tree might be doing it a disservice because, dude, this thing is massive. Like, the size of a whole island big. In fact, it's so big that based on the picture we see at the end of the chapter, it looks like a majority of Elbaf is actually housed on top of this tree. And look, I know all signs were pointing towards us being on Elbaf this whole time, but given how things tend to work in manga and anime with misdirections and all, I didn't want to commit to us actually being on the island until we got official confirmation, which obviously we got in this chapter, and I cannot wait to go over it. But before that, I do want to briefly address the Yamato cover story. I only really talk about this when I feel like something of note is happening in it, which I think this mysterious person attempting to steal Yasui's sword is, because I have a feeling that this will somehow lead towards Yamato finally stepping in and trying to solve the recent string of kidnappings we found out about a couple chapters ago, because so far she has been strangely hands off on that. But since she was tasked with delivering Yasui's sword to his gravesite, maybe having it stolen right from under her will get her moving towards solving this mystery and add some serious interest to the cover story, because so far, it's honestly not really doing much for me. Now, getting back to the chapter, we technically start things off with Robin's half of the crew back on board the Great Eric. We actually go back and forth between them and Luffy's group on Elbaf throughout 1130, but their portions of the chapter actually are much more important when it comes to moving the story forward, so I'm going to save it for the end so I can cover it all at once. So, getting back to Luffy and co., coming off the ending of 1129, we see that after breaking their way out of Rhodes' room, they found themselves outside of the real castle that Rhodes Lego 1 was based on. Though, so far, the castle is the only part of his diorama that even resembles the actual island, seeing as his Lego built Elbaf had a severe lack of mountains and snow. But I get the feeling that it's supposed to represent his ideal version of what the island should look like. He's probably not that big a fan of the whole winter aesthetic. I can kind of agree with him on that. And speaking of Rhodes, almost as soon as they break free from his room, the crew end up running into and hiding from two of his crewmates. Gerd, the new giant warrior pirate's doctor, and Goldberg, the crew's cook. The former, who spends a majority of her screen time in this chapter complaining about their very eccentric navigator. Turns out the crew, or at the very least Gerd, does not like Rhodes, seeing him as basically a creep, which after how we saw him react to Nami in the last chapter, yeah, I can't blame her. But despite his creepiness, he is apparently a very skilled navigator according to Goldberg, so I guess Haruden chose to overlook his less redeeming qualities in exchange for his skills. Oh, and also, I called the captain of the new giant warrior pirates Hadruden in my last review, but turns out the J is actually meant to be silent, so his name is actually pronounced Haruden. Now, we do find out that, like we speculated, Rhodes was using his crow Mugen to kidnap humans that it found traveling near Elbaf, using the justification that trespassing on the Island of Giants is illegal, so by being in close proximity to it, the tiny humans are breaking the law, and as such, he's allowed to imprison them inside his Legoland for their crimes. Which is obviously just him abusing a loophole so that he can get his own collection of living toys without getting in trouble for it, despite the fact that it looks like every other giant on Elbaf does not agree with this idea. And though this does make me wonder, if the other giants aren't okay with him doing this to normal humans, why would he try to do this with the Straw Hats? I mean, it's not like he didn't immediately recognize them once Mugen dropped them off, and he knew that Dory and Broggy had went to go and bring them back to the Elbaf, so, like, he knew they were allowed to travel to the island. So yeah, after reading the chapter, I'm just trying to figure out exactly why he thought this would be a good idea, and in my mind, it seems like he didn't even think this a fraction of the way through. I don't know, like Gerd said, dude's weird. And speaking of Gred, she mentions reporting Rhodes to Elder Durul when she finds out he's been kidnapping humans again, and the panel where she talks about that, she looks a little bit too happy to be selling out one of her crewmates. She also mentions that he's worse than Prince Loki, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, if you don't remember who Jarul is, I don't blame you. I'm talking about the giant, not the musician. Though, depending on who you ask these days, the answer would probably be the same regardless. Jarul is the previous co-captain of the giant warrior pirates alongside his friend Jorul. They are actually the ones who passed on the title of co-captain to Dory and Broggy, and I believe have only shown up as part of Big Mom's flashback before this, which is a shame because he is a character directly responsible for the birth of one of my top 5 favorite characters in all One Piece, Charlotte Katakuri. And no, honestly, I don't mean to say that he's Katakuri's dad or anything like that. Katakuri's tall, but he's clearly not giant tall. No, what I mean is that Ja Rule gave Big Mom the ability to have Katakuri and all of her other 84 children by not beheading her as a kid after she devastated an Elbaf village and mortally wounded Ja Rule during one of her hunger-induced rampages. Had it not been for Ja Rule agreeing to spare Linlin's life in exchange for her exile from Elbaf, she would have been killed right then and there, meaning she would have never went on to join Rocks, become an Emperor of the Sea, or give birth to Katakuri. So, we had to thank Ja Rule for seeing reason and not sending us into the dark timeline where we miss out on one of the coolest characters ever introduced in this series. Now, Grad mentions looking for the humans Road kidnapped as proof to get him in trouble with Ja Rule, and she'll definitely find plenty in his room trying to escape, but unfortunately, she calls them intruders, which is all Nami hears, and it's enough for her to want to avoid any giants they might run into, trying her best to keep the crew out of trouble. Now, obviously, we as readers know they'd be fine if they interacted with these two giants because their captain is working directly under Luffy, but Nami has no idea who either of these two are, so it's in her best interest to try to avoid them. But it is kind of a shame because had she just let Luffy call out to Gred and Goldberg right here, then things honestly would have been a lot better for them. They wouldn't have to aimlessly travel through this snowy landscape or risk their lives trying to cross a bridge hovering over a forest full of giant wolves. Instead, they'd probably just be partying inside the castle, waiting for the other half of their crew to eventually show up on the island. But again, as far as they're aware, they're trespassing right now, and they only know a handful of friendly giants, and these two are not one of them. So it's in their best interest to try to sneak by them and just cross the bridge without getting caught. Which, by the way, the bridge is obviously meant for giants, so to the Straw Hats, the gaps between planks are so big that they had to jump across them, a point which both Nami and Usopp end up complaining about, which I just found funny considering as far as I can tell, they're both seemingly riding the chopper and not actually crossing the bridge themselves. Actually, scratch that, I just went back and checked, and only Nami is currently riding chopper. Usopp is right beside him, sheepishly making his way across the bridge, which as a man who is definitely afraid of heights, I salute him for even attempting this. Now, while they're crossing, Luffy says that he could hear something back when they were in the diorama, like a roar echoing and calling out to him, and now he's getting goosebumps as they cross over the forest. So he decides to go and check it out while the rest go on ahead. And this is where I'm going to transition over to the other half of the crew on board the Great Eric, because their half of the story builds up to the journey Luffy's going on. So, going all the way back to the beginning of this chapter, Frankie and the rest of the Straw Hats call off to search for the missing 5 due to having exhausted all their options and supplies, mostly their food and booze, and they decide to trust that Luffy and Co will make their way to Elbaf eventually, they just had to wait for them there. I like this because it just goes to show how much faith these 4 have in their crewmates, though it does make me question the whole timeline of events, because as far as I'm aware, they woke up 2 days later on board the Great Eric after passing through the, the slumbering mist or something like that, and noticed that the crew was missing. And as far as I'm aware, since they woke up and started searching, it's only been a few hours. So how have they already run out of food? Actually, you know what? Scratch that, because I just remembered they're coming off a huge party that Luffy was a part of. And yeah, it's not going to take them long to get through all their food, even if it was meant for giants. And you know what? I also just remembered that Bonnie's on board the ship as well. And considering she eats almost as much as Luffy does, it's surprising they had any food left to begin with. Now, while they're on their way to Elbaf, the morning paper gets dropped off to them, and it has some pretty shocking news. First off, the destruction of Egghead is being blamed solely on the Giants, which has earned the returning co-captains Dory and Broggy a huge bounty increase, each now being worth 1.8 billion berries. Something that greatly upsets the two of them, seeing as they didn't plan on actually making a return to being pirates. And as we figured he would, Luffy is being blamed for Vegapunk's murder, which I guess means even though it's not mentioned in this chapter, he'll at the very least be getting another bounty increase once his arc is over. Oda just probably wanted to wait until Luffy could see it and react to reveal what it is to us. I have to imagine that at this point his bounty is getting pretty close to Shanks, meaning that their meeting might not be as far off as I thought. Now, while looking over the article, Robin notices an X mark on Luffy's arm in the picture, which, given that she was a huge part of the Alabasta arc, my favorite arc in all One Piece, she kind of recognizes it, but not enough to know what it means. Of course, we the readers know it's meant to be a sign from Vivi, either signaling to the crew that she's safe or calling for their help. I'm more inclined to think the former as of right now, because even though Morgan seemed to be fed up with her butting into how he runs his paper, I don't really see him turning her in by choice. Hell, even if the government tried to force his hand, I still don't see him doing it unless she is actively causing his business to suffer. And look, I just want to be clear, this is not me saying that I think that deep down Morgan is a good person. I'm just saying that based on what we've seen from him so far, when the government tries to force him to do something, he has a tendency to tell them to go fuck themselves. But regardless, I'm looking forward to seeing Luffy and Co's reactions to the X mark in the picture, and whether or not this will push them towards reuniting with their honorary crewmate. Anyway, some more dialogue happens, and we end up finding out that apparently Haruden is actually one of the sons of Elbaf's king, King Harold, making him a prince, and that he wanted his crew to be the ones to go and help the Straw Hats out on Egghead, but Dory and Brocky used their seniority to go instead. Mostly because they wanted to see Luffy again, but I think it also had to do with them not wanting to deal with the trouble back on the island. Now this is when we get into the huge lore dump for Elbaf. So apparently there is a legendary devil fruit that is passed down in the royal family from generation to generation. I'm assuming to each king. What the devil fruit is or does, we don't know yet. But whatever it is, it was enough to kill for. And that's exactly what happened. One of the princes killed their father in order to get their hands on it. And said prince is exactly who Luffy could sense from atop the bridge and went off to find, bringing us to the incredible double page spread where we reveal Luffy coming face to face with Prince Loki. This, in my opinion, was hands down one of the best character reveals in the entire series. I mean, all this time we've been going off the goofy silhouette we saw ages ago to try and guess what he looked like, but the design couldn't be more different. And you know what? That's kind of on us. I mean, it's not like it's the first time Oda completely changed the design of a character he first introduced through a silhouette when they finally showed up in person. I'm pretty sure the same thing happened back with Kaido and Big Mom. I think they also had more goofy designs at first, only to end up looking much more serious when they finally showed up on panel. And I actually saw someone post a pretty interesting theory on Twitter. If this is what Oda does with characters who had goofy silhouettes, then maybe we'll end up doing the opposite with characters that had cool ones. Which, if true, means that despite Rox looking pretty cool in his, he might actually end up looking more like Vegapunk once we finally see him. Anyway, getting back to Loki, who is both chained up to a tree and blindfolded. Like I mentioned, it's unclear if he managed to eat this legendary devil fruit or not after killing his father, but one thing we can say for sure is that he is incredibly powerful. It apparently taken the combined might of all the warriors on Elbaf to capture him, which is just too bad they went through all that trouble just for Luffy to end up freeing him now that he's actually met him. Because that is clearly where the story is going. The only question now is, will he end up being a villain we had to punch, or is there still some other unnamed antagonist for this arc that we have yet to be introduced to? Odds are probably the former, seeing as one of the only things he says to Luffy is how he's going to burn the world down, but the jury's still out on whether or not he's being serious or just putting on a show. Either way, things just got a lot more interesting with his reveal, and even though I was enjoying the fun adventure of the last 3 chapters, I'm looking forward to seeing where this encounter with Loki leads us next.